politics in the United Kingdom. On the program this week, a conversation with two British members of Parliament, Gordon Brown, the Shadow Trade Secretary, and Anthony Blair, the Shadow Home Secretary. As leaders in the opposition party, they are responsible for formulating policies in their area of expertise. The two joined us during a visit to the nation's capital recently, where they met with members of Congress and officials in the Clinton transition. Mr. Brown and Mr. Blair shared their perspectives on U.S. politics and discussed the differences between Britain's parliamentary system and the form of government here in the United States.
Mr. Anthony Blair, a member of the House of Commons in Great Britain and a member of the Labour Party, what brings you to the United States?
We've got a new administration coming in here, which is obviously very exciting, and we've been talking to some people partly about the strategy for the election campaign and then also about the program that the government's going to have. And so it's fascinating for us to come over and discuss things, partly about how Bill Clinton managed to win the election, but partly also the types of things he's going to do in government.
Is a Labour Party member the same as a member of the Democratic Party in the United States?
Not exactly, but I think there's common cause in a number of issues. One of the things that I'm here to do is to meet people to talk about economic policy, not just from the administration, but the Federal Reserve Bank, World Bank, and look at the scope for international economic cooperation. And I think the election of President Clinton is going to make a difference to that. And I think it's very interesting to look at how we can cooperate across continents on economic policy. So there is a common cause, there's an interest in similar policies that are being pursued in different countries and similar difficulties that different countries face.
Why did John Major win and George Bush lose?
Do you want to answer that first, or shall I? Well, you've got to be careful, obviously, of just making comparisons that may be glib and not really stand up. But I think that, in the end, John Major benefited from a very large extent to the fact that he took over from Margaret Thatcher, and therefore there was a sort of change of, almost people thought there was a change of government before the British election when Margaret Thatcher went and John Major took over. And I think in some ways the Democrats had an advantage here in that President Bush was very much saddled with the problems of the economy and so forth, and despite our best efforts, Mr. Major wasn't held responsible for those in quite the same way that President Bush was held responsible for the problems here in the United States. So, I mean, there are all sorts of differences, but I think that that was one of the key ones.
Well, I suppose what Tony's saying is that John Major wasn't known and George Bush was. People knew the record of the Republican administration, not just over George Bush's years, but over the years in which he was vice president to Ronald Reagan. And I think there was a tiredness, as far as I can see, in the administration, and there was a sense that they couldn't solve the big economic problems. As far as Britain was concerned, although Margaret Thatcher had been in power for many years, John Major was relatively unknown. He was only in power for just over a year and a bit when he fought the general election, and I think, as Tony said, there was a feeling that he should be given a chance. Now, I think the events since the election have made people think twice about it. I think,
Great Britain.
Well, we're running pretty far ahead in the opinion polls at the moment, and I think people are very dissatisfied about promises that were made by John Major at the election that have not been honoured. He said the recovery would come almost overnight. He said that public spending would be increased in quite specific ways. He said that youth training would be guaranteed to all young people unemployed. He said that repossessions of houses would stop and things like that. So there's a disenchantment already pretty clear about the Major administration, even after 9 months since the election.
A little refresher course there. How many members in the British House of Commons?
That's a question that some people, even who are members of the House of Commons, don't know the answer to.
I'm glad
it's about six.
Started to answer that.
I think it's 650.
I mean, there's a 65 member of Parliament difference, I think, between ourselves and the Conservatives. They get roughly, what is it, 330, and we got about 270.
That's what I wanted to ask you next. You have about 270, you say?
Yeah, out of 650.
And how many in the Patty Ashdown party?
That's about 20, I think. It's very small.
Our audience got to know Neil Kinnock pretty well over time, and he's no longer around. What happened to Neil Kinnock?
Oh, Neil Kinnock's very much around. He's no longer leader of the Labour Party.
That's what I mean. We don't see him.
But he's still a member of Parliament. If people are watching Prime Minister's Question Time, they may see him asking questions from the backbenches this time to the Prime Minister, and he's still very active in British politics. He's a member of the Labour Party's National Executive Committee, so he's still very active. But of course it's John Smith who's the leader of the Labour Party, and he's done exceedingly well since he got elected, and I think they'll be seeing him scoring many points against John Major at Prime Minister's Question Time when you see it here in the States.
In this country, we have the Republican National Committee and the Democratic National Committee, and the chairman of those groups are voted on by members of the different committees that are, you know, elected from the state parties around the country, with the exception of the party in power. And the party in power, the President of the United States, usually names, for instance, this time around, the Democratic National Committee chairman will be somebody that the President wants in that job. How does John Smith get his job in the Labour Party in Great Britain?
Well, it's done through a system of voting that involves party members. That's all the members of the party, and also members of Parliament. And then there has been, although this is a subject that's being debated at the moment, there has been also some of those affiliated bodies, trade unions, cooperative societies and so forth, they've also had a vote directly in the say of the leadership. And so it's a sort of electoral college made up of those three components. And we had after Neil Kinnock indicated that he was going to stand down, we had an election that lasted, I think, about 2 or 3 months in the Labour Party, both the leadership and the deputy leadership. And Margaret Beckett, who you've interviewed, became the deputy leader, and John's been the leader. And I think it's certainly given us a great sort of sense of renewal and sense of purpose since they've taken the leadership. Unlike
in this country, the leader of the party is not a member of the House of Representatives, what kind of power does John Smith have in the House of Commons?
Well, it is a very different system, because the government gains its authority from its ability to win votes in the House of Commons. And if it didn't win votes in the House of Commons, then it would fall in its entirety. Now, John Smith, as leader of the opposition, has a pivotal role because he has got to expose the government's failures in the House of Commons by debates, by questions, and by leading the argument. And he's been doing extremely well since he became elected, and he's well known for his great performances in the House of Commons. So the debates are in the House of Commons, the argument is fought out in the House of Commons, and John Smith is clearly leading the attack from within the House of Commons.
Also, you see, now the House of Commons is actually televised. That's made a big difference, because it's given a whole new aura to parliamentary debates. They're very much more important. They appear in our news schedules every night. And then John Smith obviously has power as the leader of the Labour Party, because although the principal appointments, the people that will shadow the various government ministers, for example, Gordon shadows the Treasury Secretary and I shadow the Home Affairs Secretary, although the principal appointments are actually elected in a shadow cabinet of about, I think it's 18 or 19 members, John Smith will then appoint all the other members of the front bench team, which may be another 40 or 50 or 60 people even. So it's very considerable. The leader in the House of Commons terms is not just the person that really takes the brunt of the attack and carries it to the Prime Minister, but has also got tremendous patronage within the system.
But he is also leader of the party, not just leader in the House of Commons. He's leader of the party. He's responsible for organising the party's affairs. He will speak to the party's conference. He's the senior member of the party's National Executive Committee. So whereas in the States, the Democratic organisation is not so much built around the one leader across the 4 or 5 years of a Senate or of between presidential elections. In Britain, the leader is both the leader of the party in Parliament and the leader of the party in the country.
How long have you been in House of Commons?
About 9 years.
10 years next June.
I came in 1983, and so did Tony. When the Labour Party started to change after its defeat at that election. We've had a very big intake at the last election, because although we lost the last election, we got a large number of additional seats and narrowed the Conservative majority to just over 20, so we're within a very small number of seats of actually taking control.
How many times have you run for office?
I've run 4 times and won 3.
Yeah. 3? Have you stood for election in the House of Commons 3 different times?
I stood in 1979 and didn't win, and then I've stood in 1983, 87 and 92 and won. And I represent a constituency in Scotland, and Tony represents a constituency in the northeast of England.
Why did you get in this business?
That's a question my wife asks me often. Because because I held certain beliefs very strongly, a belief principally that Britain had to operate as a society and community if the individuals within it were to prosper and get on in life. And I wanted to try and translate those beliefs into actuality in government.
Where's home?
Home, I split between the constituency, which is in County Durham, up in the north of England, and in London. So we sort of go between the two.
How far are you from London? And you do come train or drive?
It's probably, I sometimes fly or take the train. Occasionally I drive. I mean, it will sound a very short distance in your terms, but it's actually right up in the north of England. It's about 270, 300 miles.
What were you doing before you got into politics?
I was a barrister, an advocate, and...
What's that mean in our language?
Well, it means you're a lawyer, but you're the lawyers that stand up in court for particular clients.
Went to school where?
I went to school, first of all, in Durham, which is near where my constituency is, and then I was at school in Edinburgh, and then I went on to Oxford University. And then I became a barrister and went into Parliament in 1983.
How did you get into this business?
Partly through being, having been brought up in Scotland, which is a very strong Labour part of the country, and even though we've lost elections, Scotland's got a very strong representation, more than 48, I think, MPs out of 72, so we've got 2/3 of the members of Parliament, so Scotland's a very strong Labour area. And my father, in fact, was a minister, a church minister, so I was influenced partly through religion, partly through my contacts meeting people politically, partly through, I think, the genuine concern at the time I was growing up about the waste of resources, about unemployment, about poverty, about the feeling that people weren't given an opportunity to realise their potential. And so I stood originally in a Labour seat we didn't win, one that was more difficult to win, and eventually I stood in an area which is effectively my home area in Fife in Scotland.
We have been watching a story here. It's technical, but maybe you can help us in whether or not there's behind this story some tension. British Air tried to buy a big chunk of U.S. Air, which is an American airline, and eventually pulled out of the thing because the American government said, unless you let us into Britain and fly in different places there, we're not going to let you in here and have, you know, close to control of an airline. But behind that was this trade discussion that goes on between our two countries. Is there a problem that's being created with this kind of a deadlock? Do you follow these kind of things that closely?
Yeah, we obviously follow them very closely because they're extremely important. I think that everybody, in principle, recognizes the advantages of free trade and of an open trading market. But I think particularly at times of recession and difficulty, when there's great cutbacks and problems at home, then there's a natural tendency for countries and indeed governments to want to pull back. But I think it's very important that the process of open trade goes on, because I think it would be disastrous, particularly if the GATT talks were to fail. I think it would be absolutely disastrous for the long-term future of the world economy. And of course in Europe, we have just a few days ago, at the beginning of the year, we've opened up the single market in Europe, which means all the trade barriers, in theory at least, are supposed to come down so that we can trade freely between all the 12 member countries of the European community. And I think that there is still, I would say, a broad consensus in favour of that proposition of open and free trade.
Anything to add?
Well, I think increasingly we're an interdependent economy, and companies that operate in one country are going to operate in other countries. I think what perhaps worries people is that there is the growth of these three big trading blocs, and inevitably there will be scope for competition and conflict. And I think the job of economic policy is to try to minimize these conflicts, to try to deal with some of the problems that do exist. And agricultural policy is clearly one, which is preventing agreement in the GATT talks, and try to build greater economic cooperation. That's why, for example, today I've been talking to the World Bank, and I'm quite interested in the possibilities that can develop over the next few years, particularly with the new administration, for greater cooperation to deal with some of these issues, perhaps in G7, perhaps in new organizations.
For the first time in 12 years, the same party, the Democratic Party, will control the U.S. House, the U.S. Senate, and the White House, which is somewhat close to what you have in the House of Commons. When you look at this country from Great Britain and you look at Bill Clinton, what are the things that you're seeing from over there?
I think that you see, first of all, very strongly this idea that the problems that the country faces can only be met by a government that's prepared to be active, that sets itself key objectives that it's prepared to try and fulfill. the development of employment, training and education, infrastructure, the belief that unless there's the right partnership between government and people, then the economic problems simply can't be overcome. I think that's one thing. I think secondly, too, that Clinton has impressed me enormously by generating a great deal of excitement, by preparing to be open in policy making, by appearing at least to sort of break through new ground for the Democrat Party. And I think that that's a development that I mean, it's always difficult to judge from afar, but it's a development that has impressed us and that we will obviously be looking at for ourselves.
What kind of people will you meet with here? You meet with House members?
We will certainly do that, and also meet with people who have been active in the campaign. I mean, it's important, as Gordon was saying earlier, one of the reasons we're here is actually to try and look at some of the programs that are going to be developed by the administration. I mean, one of my interests is law and order and crime rate, because that's the Home Affairs brief in Britain. And you've obviously got your problems here, and we've got developing problems at home as well. And so these are the types of issues we want to discuss with them.
There were, before I come, do you have something you want to add?
No, sir.
I was going to say, in this town that we live in here, in the District of Columbia, which is 600,000 people, 450 people were killed last year. Is that kind of thing going on in London?
Not to anything like the same extent, although I think there's a very big worry in our country that things are going to go the same way. And you know, in a sense, what we're trying to do is to break through this idea that you either simply say, well, it's all the fault of society and what we need is more government spending, or on the other hand, people saying, well, you know, you sort of just lock them up in as large numbers as you possibly can, and people are trying to break through that and say, look, you've got to give people opportunity, but with that opportunity comes responsibility. And I think that that's a very, very important notion, because otherwise you're going to find that many of these inner city areas people just can't live in. And we can see some of these problems beginning in our country, and we want to make sure that they don't grow.
Urban crime is a huge problem in Britain as well as America, and I think politicians are having to be challenged to look at new ideas of dealing with it. Crack is a problem in the States, as you know, and there are signs of that becoming a problem in Britain as well. The last time I was here, I actually went round with the police and looked at how they were dealing with some of these problems, and I think we're all going to have to cope with them. So what we can learn from each other is obviously going to be quite important. I think the social problems that the new Clinton administration are planning to deal with, partly by the program for education, for training, for pathways out of poverty for people, will be an opportunity not just for Britain but for Europe to look at how successful these can be.
What would you tell Americans about your health system? Because that's going to be a big topic of discussion this year. And don't hesitate to explain how yours works compared to ours. Have you looked at the differences?
Well, I've visited hospitals in America. I've talked to people who are concerned about the future of the healthcare system, and I know that that's going to be one of the huge issues that's going to be dealt with by the new administration. We have a very different system in Britain. I think that we have done relatively well by operating health through the public sector. It's a system relatively free at the point of need for people, paid for by a national insurance system, not by private insurance, but paid for by national insurance, and a system that covers everyone. The funny thing when you look at it is that although we've got this comprehensive coverage, the percentage of national income that is spent on health in Britain is actually less than in America. And of course the reason is that you have very high healthcare costs, higher than ours. And the reason also, I suspect, is that some treatments are prescribed to people for commercial reasons, when in Britain the test really is what is the need and what is the medical reason for doing something.
I mean, we're both big supporters of the National Health Service, and I mean that's on practical rather than simply ideological grounds. And I think that although there's been problems with our National Health Service, and it would be wrong to pretend there weren't, the idea that my generation's grown up with in Britain, that if you're sick you will be cared for irrespective of your wealth or your ability to pay, I mean that is now a basic belief that underpins our society, and I don't think that any political party, at least openly, would want to challenge that. And we believe that on the whole, it yields efficiency as well, because you're pooling resources and you don't get these big vested interests of doctors, insurance companies and so forth within the system that end up subverting it for their own purposes rather than really, running healthcare in the interests of the people.
Let me say, there is obviously a big argument in Britain about the future of healthcare as well. I mean, there is concern. We've got 1 million people on healthcare waiting lists. People rightly feel that insufficient resources are devoted to healthcare. But the principle in Britain that healthcare should be provided to people irrespective of their ability to pay when they need it is something that I think has commanded consent in Britain for, what, 45 years. And although there have been some pressures within the Conservative Party to change that principle, they would find it very difficult to persuade the electorate that you shouldn't have a health service based on meeting people's needs when they arise, irrespective of what resources they had.
How often do you two go home to your constituency?
Most weekends, really, and all the holiday times. Yeah.
Well, I would go home just about every weekend. I'd fly from London to Edinburgh, which is the nearest airport, and I suppose it's easier for us to get back in a smaller country than it is for senators and congressmen or women to get back from Washington. But I think over the last 10 years, it has been an increasing expectation of the electorate that the members of Parliament will stay in their constituencies and will be more active there.
Do you, either one of you, do you earn money other than what you earn as being a member of the House?
No, we're both full-time members of Parliament. I mean, you pick up bits and pieces doing writing and so forth occasionally.
How much do you make a year? What's the salary?
Now, the salary is about £30,000.
Which is about $45,000. Compared to American Congress people that make
Have I got that right?
$30,000.
Yeah, the salary has just been frozen, actually, as part of the government's wages policy.
We voted to freeze our salary out of...
But I think it shouldn't be forgotten that there are allowances to provide for secretarial staff and for research help. Not as great as in America, and I think we've learnt a lot from the need to have proper servicing of your constituents.
How many people work for you?
About 5. Mm-hmm.
And where are they located?
Part-time, full-time, some.
And where are they located?
I've got 2 people working for me in my constituency, and they're dealing essentially with constituents' letters and complaints, and you do get a tremendous number of these, whether it's about housing or social security or about the issues of the day. And then I've got 3 or 4 people from time to time, 3 at the moment, working for me in London.
And yours?
It's about the same. I mean, the big problem we have is that, when we're shadowing the Treasury Secretary, the Home Affairs Secretary, we're shadowing his entire department. So, you really need quite a big resource base to do that, because they've obviously got thousands of civil servants at their disposal. And that is it is a difficulty. I mean, with the constituency work, you can just about manage, but there's been a continuing problem over a long period of time for the opposition party to really make an impact when, the inequality of resources between government and opposition is so vast, and that's something that we rather envy your congressmen and senators.
In the House of Representatives or in the Senate, there are the Senate committees, the House committees, and they're staffed by people paid for from public funds, but at the service of the Congress and the Senate. Now, in Britain, in the House of Parliament, most of the staff that we have are not paid for through the House of Commons itself. They're not servants of the House of Commons. They are our own employees. So we don't have the huge backup staff that's available to a Senate committee.
Where do you get the money to pay for them?
Well, as I say, there are allowances, very small allowances, as far as the numbers you can employ for extra staff that are given to every MP. There's a special allowance if you're on the front bench. In other words, as the shadow Treasury spokesman, or Tony as the shadow Home Secretary, will get 1 additional member of staff. But it's pretty small in relation to the task that we've got, which is challenging half a dozen ministers in each department.
Depending on when you talk to them or who it is, our members say they spend from 30 to 80% of their time raising money to run again. Mm-hmm. How much does it cost you to run?
Yeah, well, that's not a problem for us. But I mean, partly because we can't advertise on television.
Cannot advertise?
No, and there are limits on the actual expenditure in elections.
There's a direct limit on what can be spent in an individual constituency.
You wouldn't believe how little we spend on an election. I mean, the last election that I fought, I suppose we spent about £5,000.
But that's for individual members of Parliament. As an individual standing for election, I can only spend about £4,000 to £5,000, which is, you say, is about $7,500 to $8,000. As a party, however, fighting an election, we've got to raise our money for party purposes, and that's a great difficulty for us, because The Conservatives have access to quite big funds, and we've always had less funds to enable us to fight an election. And we don't have the laws that you have in the States, where there is state funding for the presidential campaigns.
Is there a limit to how much money you can raise as a party?
As a party, no, there's not. You can spend as much money as you want. I think there's no.
Do you have to disclose who gives to a party?
No, you don't.
There are problems in British electoral law that have got to be dealt with. One is, of course, as you say, that there is no limit on what a party can spend. So the Conservatives, some people say, spent up to about £20 million at the last election, which is not great by American standards, but we would probably, as a Labour Party, only have half of that. Equally, at the same time, the laws on declaration are pretty limited, and so Conservatives, for example, it is said, got quite a lot of money from abroad. Now, where it came from, I don't know.
So you don't really ever have to say how much money you spent as a party?
No, only as an individual candidate.
And it's not registered anywhere who spent money with the party?
Well, I think companies have to declare the money that they give to political parties and so forth. But and there are, I mean, trade unions will declare it, but there's nothing like the tightness of regulation that there is here.
Depending on who you talk to, there's something like 80,000 lobbyists that hit this town from time to time. Yeah. Do you have a thing called a lobbyist?
Yes, we do, and it's growing. It's growing. I mean, I think it ties in with something I was saying earlier. One of the problems that we are finding in our system now is that a lot of the legislation that comes before the House of Commons is very complicated. If your members of Parliament aren't actually resourced themselves, then the risk is that the lobbyists have enormous power simply because they have the resources to give you information. And lobbying has grown in Britain over the past 10 years since we've both been members of Parliament to a very great extent. It's nothing like it is here, but you can see how it's moving in that particular direction.
What if British Telecom comes to you and says, Gordon Brown, we're going to have a big weekend at Bath, and all expense paid. We'll take a limousine and drive you out there and put you up in a hotel and give you first-class suite and all that kind of stuff. Can you do that? And do you do that?
Well, I wouldn't. They're unlikely to come to me because I've been one of the biggest critics, and I've actually been calling for telephone prices to come down for some time. But it is something, of course, that is a risk in any democratic system, whether it be a local politician or a national politician. And I think you've got to rely on people themselves not being prepared to take these sort of bribes or help.
Yeah, and I think the one thing that has I think worried us looking across the Atlantic is this degree of time that's spent on raising money, and also that just the necessary reliance then on that fundraising to do anything you want to do in politics. Now it's just part of your system, and I understand it, but it's something that I think would give us pause for thought.
We've got just 2 minutes. Looking ahead, when does the House of Commons come back into session?
Next Monday, and from next Monday onwards, there's going to be quite heavy and quite angry debates about the economy, about unemployment, about Europe. I think 2 days next week are devoted to the Maastricht Treaty, which of course is the treaty about European integration. And there's going to be quite strong arguments on that.
Well, on the Monday, actually, before that, there is the a bill about asylum seekers and immigration, which I should be doing in the House of Commons, so I'll be back on my feet on Monday.
When is the earliest you think there could be another election?
Well, with a government with a majority of only 21.
Our prediction.
Government with a majority of 21, there's obviously difficulties it can have along the way. It almost was defeated only 2 months ago. I hope the election will come sooner rather than later.
Your prediction?
I can't see it coming very soon, but I hope it comes as soon as possible.
Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, both members of the British House of Commons, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
That concludes this discussion on British politics. For more information, write to our guests at the British House of Commons, SW1A 0AA, London, England. And the Supreme Court of the United States.